Hello, little people that live in my computer, and welcome to the new and refocused channel. My name is still Commander Braun Solo, and today we're going to be discussing an album that I have just kind of had stuck in my head for the last month or so since I first heard it. It has really just been rolling around in there and just cooking, and I just wanted a reason to talk about it, so here we are. And that album is, as you can see above, Uboa's 2019 album titled The Origin of My Depression. Uboa, also known as Zandra Metcalf, is an Australian-based singer, songwriter, and just all-around musician that has had an ever-evolving music style that has ranged from sludge metal to harsh noise wall to power electronics, but generally speaking, nowadays she likes to kind of keep her own personal title to the non-genre that is experimental music. So that way she doesn't get locked down in any one style. This whole album is a look at Zandra's life up to this point, from her struggles with gender dysphoria, depression, anxiety, fears of abandonment, and just a lot more. In this album, she truly lays out her entire heart for the audience to see, and she dissects it piece by piece, taking apart each chamber and slowly peeling back every piece of tissue to show us her heart. Is at times a very peaceful and sobering experience, and at other times a truly uncomfortable and unsettling experience. This album was made following a messy breakup and a suicide attempt, the result of which we can see on the cover of the album, which Uboa has said in interviews she was originally intending to take a selfie following her suicide attempt in the hospital, but she was still a little bit whacked out because it was an attempted overdose, and she didn't realize that the selfie camera was facing away from her, and she ended up capturing this kind of haunting picture of her own feet, and it's made even more haunting by the context of it, which is this picture very well may have never existed had it not been for the doctors. She is, at this point, as she said in interviews, glad that it didn't happen, glad that it didn't go through. And you know what? I am too, because this album has been just very cathartic for me. When she was asked about the creative process behind this album, she said that it was almost entirely made up of improvisation with no conscious intention, and she also took bits and pieces from some of her live shows and edited those in a studio and put them together in ways that kind of just intuitively made sense. She has stated that the tracks were intuited and palpated around themes that seemed to gel into something cohesive. She has also said that each of these tracks deals with thoughts or ideas that would invade her mind while going through different depressive episodes or psychosis or periods of disassociation. With all that being said, this is going to be the last chance to heed the content warning from the beginning of the episode. The themes in this album get very dark and very heavy, and we will be talking about them quite a bit. For some of you, this can also be a cathartic experience, as it was for me. But for others, I understand that it can be a lot to hear and a lot to think about. So feel free to leave the video and come back at another time when you're feeling more up to it, or not at all. In the future, I will be doing lighter hearted videos on lighter albums that aren't this. Anyway, the first track on this album is titled Detransitioning, which refers to when a trans person that has gone through some or all of the process of transitioning decides to, for whatever reason, transition or detransition back to their assigned gender at birth, either due to social pressures or unacceptance from those around them, such as family or friends, or professional settings. Also, someone could choose to detransition just because they tried it and decided that it wasn't right for them. And this is something that Xandra will talk about later in the album. I think the opening part of this song, where the piano is being played, I kind of describe it as being played in a way that feels quite unsure of itself and kind of like it doesn't know quite where it's going yet or quite where the music is leading it. And to me, I think this really kind of cements that feeling, inside of me at least, of kind of the uncertainty that comes with questioning your own gender identity or dealing with anything in that kind of realm, because it is quite a scary thing. to deconstruct the ways that you've been feeling your whole life and try to apply them in new ways. And also, kind of, again, to me, feels like the musical equivalent of imposter syndrome, which is kind of that feeling of constant self doubt that you have, that you might be transgender or you might not be, or sometimes you think that you are, other times you think that you might just be doing it for the attention, but then you just keep going back and forth, confirming and deconfirming these things, and it's absolutely hellish to go through. And that's just what this opening piano sequence reminds me of. But as this is going on, these lyrics are also being sang by Zandra, and I think these are key to kind of what is happening in the song as well, because she ends up singing about a glimmer of hope that gets stamped out by those not listening. And I think to me, this is kind of talking about that feeling where you're starting to pass, or you're starting to feel kind of what's called gender euphoria, where you're starting to fit in and feel the gender that you are internally, but also externally now, only to have those feelings stomped out by people that just refuse to see you for the person you are, either intentionally or even unintentionally. And they undermine you and they try to push you back into the closet or advocate for like legislation against you and all that other kind of stuff. But I also think that those not listening could also be talking about like the very well meaning liberal that want to include you and they want to accept you and they want to respect you, but they do it in a way that is quite tokenizing almost. And I think that can be almost as invalidating as someone just straight up denying your identity and denying, like, to acknowledge that. And this verse here I also find super interesting because I think it can be read a couple of ways, and I think both ways are equally valid, and I'm sure you've got your own interpretations too. And I think that ideation could obviously refer to one of the main themes of this album, which is suicide, suicidal ideations. But she then tries to pull herself away from that edge, and she reminds herself that she is trying her best and she wants to continue to try her best. And she pleads with herself not to hurt herself. And that's kind of a very familiar feeling to me, at least, is this wanting to continue but also not wanting to continue, and it's this internal struggle to just keep going when things don't feel quite worth it, but you want to keep trying. Another way that I could see this going is it could be talking about ideations as in how people have their ideas about her, or how she has ideas of herself and how she should be as a person, as a woman, as an artist, all these different things. And she's kind of realizing that no matter what she does, she can try her best to fill all these different ideas that people have of her and all these different ideas that she has of herself. And I forget the name of the writer, but it reminds me of that quote that it's something like hell is other people, that being perceived by other people is essentially trapping you within their psyche and their ideations of you. But going on with Xandra, she talks a lot about how I think she tries to live up to those expectations, but she knows that no matter what, you can never live up to ideas. You can absolutely never live up to ideas. And she's pleading for people not to hurt her in the way that she doesn't want them to judge her for failing to meet their expectations. And she doesn't want to judge herself for failing to meet her own expectations of herself. And it's just kind of, it seems as if maybe she could be asking for a little bit of compassion and a little bit of acceptance despite her failings. The music then starts to take a turn for the worse, and Zandra starts singing out in a kind of melancholic chorus, her voice layering on top of itself to create this. It literally sounds like a choir of her doing this just melancholic vocalizing. And then harsh bursts of noise just start playing erratically too, which to me speaks of a sort of rage filled outburst, both ones that you feel internally and ones that you express externally towards your environment and maybe those around you or towards yourself, even that you could feel maybe during a depressive state. Because for me, like when I'm in kind of those really deep depressive states, I become filled not only with just these intense feelings of despair, but also of anger, um, an urge to scream, an urge to break things, to try to, in whatever way I can, push against those feelings that I'm not quite enough, or that just everything is bad and I am bad and it's never going to get better. And it kind of feels almost like I'm lashing out, not necessarily at those around me or at myself or anything, but trying to lash out against my own feelings and just scream to myself like, why does this have to happen to me? Why the fuck can't I just be happy? What is wrong with me? And it's a really strange feeling to mix rage with despair, but that's kind of what these bursts of noise symbolize to me. And then we get more noise starting to join in on the background too. We also get the sounds of Zandra screaming in pain, and the song, as it progresses towards the end, all these noises start to meld together and form almost one singular just wall of noise, and it builds and it builds and it builds until finally we get a brief moment of silence. Just all of that anger, all of that despair falls away for the briefest of moments. And then finally, we get a just one more, one more cry out in the darkness, one more violent outburst. And then the song ends. The title track for this album starts with Xandra gasping for air, as if that final violent outburst from the last track left her wanting for breath. There is some light synth droning that's happening in the background, as well as some music like moaning from Xandra. The sounds of life are heard all around us. We can hear people talking, coughing, shuffling silverware, and a lot more is happening. This soundscape, though, leaves me at least feeling oddly isolated, as if I were feeling alone, but also in the middle of a crowded room. Xandra then begins to speak her lyrics, and she starts off the song by listing things that are not the origin of her depression. These things are gender dysphoria, poverty, being ignored, being socially awkward. But interestingly enough, in the beginning of this song, she refers to a certain you, an actual subject. She references this subject twice in the first verse, and this makes me think that maybe she's just trying to convince herself that that person, that subject, the you that she is talking about, is the one that she blames for her depression, but she's kind of in a state of denial about it. This does get made clear in the second verse, as she lists a few more things that obviously aren't the origin of her depression, right? Before changing her focus to almost entirely the subject of the song, that you. After saying that not eating isn't the origin of her depression, she says that passing out helps. And what does it help? It helps her forget. It helps her forget your white dress, which is talked about several times throughout the album, and it's never made exactly clear what this white dress is in reference to. At times, I think it could be a reference to marriage, as Zendra seems to struggle with intense feelings of abandonment throughout this entire album. And marriage could kind of be a way of promising to stay together with someone, and it could be seen as a way for Xandra to have security and a lasting companion. It could also be a reference to the white blanket that Xandra is wearing on the album cover that's adorning her after her suicide attempt, a white dress of sorts. I also think it could potentially be something more intimate to Xandra, and as far as I know, she hasn't said anything specific about the white dress in any interview. And if any of you have any information about this, I would love to hear it. But I think it could potentially be a reference to maybe a prized memory that Xandra has with her ex. Maybe during a date or some other special moment to her, her ex had worn a white dress, and in Xandra's head, that white dress has now symbolized their entire relationship. And as we will see throughout this entire album, that relationship is something that she misses dearly. She then tries to say that she has no idea what the origin of her depression is. She says it's not something that's found in her room, it's not something that was stolen by a lover, and she's kind of just saying that she's can't place her finger on what it is that is causing her to feel the way that she is. But to me, this kind of seems like a form of self-deception, and it's a self-deception that I go through when I'm in a depressive state, where I try to convince myself that there is no real cause, that maybe I don't know what triggered this state. And I do this because I probably don't want to confront, well, I definitely don't want to confront what seems like something that would be super painful to me. And instead, I rather just wait for my depressive spell to pass. After this moment of self deception, she starts to admit that the origin of her depression is no secret, seeming to me to imply that she kind of knows that everyone else knows it and that she knows it herself, what it is that she pins the blame on for her depressive state. But even during this admission, she still tries to deflect the blame back to herself. She tries to think of all the reasons why her ex would no longer love her. She tries to think of all the reasons why she no longer loves herself. And before she finally accepts what she has known all the time, she tries to lie to herself one more time and saying that her depressive states are just left up to chance, something that just kind of happened. And that's another thing that I'm kind of guilty of myself. When I'm generally going through a depressive state, I don't want to admit what it is. I don't want to confront it. I kind of just want the whole state to be over. So oftentimes I'll just use the excuse of, well, it's just my brain chemistry. It's just chemicals in my brain messing up and making me this way. Even though a lot of times I do have a trigger. There was something that triggered that state. Now, going back to the song, up to this point, the music has been relatively tame, but it has been picking up in its intensity, feeling almost like it's starting to overwhelm me or take over the space that I am occupying. And again, that feeling of being isolated in a crowded space that the song gives me starts to leave me feeling a little claustrophobic. As this is happening, we can hear the sound of a lot of people whispering around us, and Xandra finally admits that the person that she blames for this depressive state is her ex. She talks about every door being slammed shut, which I think is something that could be referencing maybe toxic relationships, where when you're in a relationship with somebody that is knowingly toxic, they tend to isolate you from family, friends, and all that stuff. But also, maybe she's also saying that by every door being slammed shut, it's every option that she had to blame her depression on has turned out just not to be it. Every door to that has been slammed shut, and this is the only thing she could think of. Everything else was just false. She then lambasts her ex, just tears into her, saying that she used to be just a very confident woman, but that her ex, through her many, as she calls them, war crimes, has torn that confidence down, just demolished her to the point where she does not love herself at all. She has no value for herself. But then again, just as the song ends, she admits that she still misses that white dress. The music continues to build in the background as the song comes to an end, but before the complete silence at the end, there is one final scream from Xandra, and then we move on to the next track, which is this track, titled Lay Down and Rot, is in reference to a concept within the incel community. And incel, for those of you not versed, is an involuntary celibate, someone that can't get a partner for whatever reasons. But it's a concept wherein someone has taken the black pill, as they call it, and they have essentially just kind of given up on life, accepted that they will never find companionship or a sexual partner or any of that stuff, and decides instead that just lying down and dying is the better option for them. Now, this track starts with an extreme outburst of noise, a stark contrast to the complete silence that we had at the end of the last track. And then we get an eerie backdrop of all sorts of noises too, and a synth droning that almost sounds like a lot of people wailing in the background. Now, Xandra has said in an interview that between the last track and this track, that moment of complete utter silence is supposed to represent the moment of death. Now, about halfway through the track, Xandra comes in heavy with her lyrics being shrieked, and it kind of betrays the idea of her just lying down and accepting death. It makes it clear that she is still struggling against the pull, and that she still seeks a cure to her circumstances. To me, these lyrics speak of someone that feels incomplete without someone else to make them whole. Without that other person, Xandra dissociates in order to not feel the pain of loneliness or the pain of abandonment. For her, love cures that state of being, that non presence that one has within their own bodies during a dissociative state. But conversely, she acknowledges that dissociation itself cannot cure those feelings of love. Kind of meaning to me that when you do dissociate, and speaking in personal experience, you temporarily escape the things that are bothering you. But when you finally come back into your own body, those problems are still there. Those emotions are still there. And it is something that you still have to deal with. And speaking to Xandra as well, from my own experience, that being around people that you enjoy does help. It does keep you present in those moments and it keeps you grounded. So we see her then wishing that dissociation could cure her love, that it could take away her feelings, that it could make it so she no longer hurts. She again talks about this white dress as if it is something that she misses. And finally, she admits that she misses an us, which to me speak of someone that draws their value from other people. Someone that by themselves does not feel value, but when they're in a unit, especially a romantic relationship, they draw their value from that, which is why she misses this us. Despite how toxic this relationship might have been for her, that's where she felt valued. The fourth track on this album is titled Appilation Joy, and to me, this is as much of a look outwards towards society from Xandra as much as it is a look inwards towards herself. And the title itself is a reference to the process of epilation, which is done with this neat little device called an epilator. And pretty much what this device is, it is a wheel of automatic tweezers. There are these little tiny teeth that rotate and rip out your hair at the roots. It is a very painful and very slow process. But for some people, it's worth it to go through because it leaves you feeling smooth and hairless for longer than shaving or waxing would, and it costs much less than laser hair removal or electrolysis. Xandra has said that the word joy in the title is in reference to the joy that one would feel in going through the pain in the pursuit of beauty. And she also says that for her, it is, quote, mixes the concept of self destruction to the act of pursuing and maintaining a gender transition. I'd personally go so far as to say that it could also just be in reference to general the kind of self destructive behaviors that we as humans do in order to maintain societal beauty standards or put forth our own gender presentations. Now, musically, this song stays pretty tame until the last couple minutes or so. Throughout a majority of the song, we hear chimes and the plucking of some stringed instrument. To my ears, it sounds a lot like a harp. There's also some other background noise, but as the song moves on and continues further, it starts to get more frantic, more manic sounding. And it reminds me of those scenes in horror movies where somebody starts to kind of become a little bit upset, a little bit anxious about everything, and they start to panic and they make a rash decision, which normally ends tragically for the rest of the cast. In the first couple verses, she refers to herself as porn unwatched, left on a drive, untouched. And to me, this sounds like someone that derives a lot of their self worth from their utility to other people. It's someone that needs to feel useful in order to feel worthy of affection, to the point that they're willing to debase themselves to that of an object, that so long as someone has a use for them and keeps them around, it's okay to be less than what you are. I also think it could be read as a statement on the objectification of trans women, as there are large parts of Western society that either ignore or demonize trans people in general. But those very same people are often found to consume explicit content featuring trans women. I think this is in large part because to them, there's a lot of stigmatization behind transness in general, and it makes trans people a taboo. And as we all know, taboos are they're fun, they're exciting, and to these people, then it makes trans women a exhilarating commodity to consume. In an interview with Justin Vellucci of Music Tap, Xandra has said, "Performing live, I frequently perform naked. Trans feminine bodies are frequently a fetishistic spectacle for the male gaze, and my reasoning is to release the naked trans body from pleasurable enjoyment by bringing in an element of terror and claiming it as mine. I played a sold out show with the body, terrified, mostly naked for the set. Trans vulnerability is also a massive component. It brings up all of these issues." As the song starts to reach its end, the music gets replaced by the sound of an audio recording that we can't quite make out, and then Xandra whispering in the background as our ears become filled with static. The final bits of spoken word in this song, Xandra has said that they are from a series of stream of consciousness rants that she recorded on a dictaphone. She says that they were about a variety of topics, from wishing she had come out sooner to womanhood, and to quote her, just plain word salad. She also said that this final part in the song, kind of taking place after the static recording that we hear, is supposed to be the descent into psychosis, and that the next song on this album is that psychosis. Oh boy, this track. This track here is easily one of the most uncomfortable to listen to on the entire album, both in the sense of actually listening to it, but also the lyrical and emotional content for me. The noise in the background is oppressive. The lyrics are screamed and strained. Zandra's voice is heavily distorted, but we can hear just the despair and the rage in her voice. She pleads not to be hurt over and over again. She pleads not to be left, not to be abandoned. She says that the act of her ex leaving, she sees it as a punishment. These are the desperate screams of someone that has a dependency, someone that has an addiction to someone. But I think in this song and in this context, she truly believes that if she is left alone, she will die. This song is less than 2 minutes long, but for me, it is the most visceral track on the album. I don't have too much to say about it, not due to lack of its substance, but just because I find it very hard to describe. And out of all the tracks here, listen to this one. This song starts very light to me, I'd say. The music in the background sounds inquisitive. It sounds a little awestruck, for lack of a better term. Or maybe it could even be described as a state of hesitant wonder. Xandra starts out talking about God's love and God being an infinitely kind being. However, she references that God has left the door ajar, which to me is a pretty interesting choice because saying ajar, it doesn't give it any sort of definitive state. It's neither fully open nor fully closed. It's, I mean, partially one of those, depending on how you look at it. It could either be partially opened or partially closed. And to me, this kind of feels like Xandra is saying that she feels like she has to try to fit make herself fit into God's love, much like you would have to try to squeeze yourself through a partially open door just to get in. Now, tinfoil hat time, because this isn't confirmed, but I mentioned back in the second song that it was interesting that she brought up something about doors being slammed shut, and I mentioned that there was potentially more meaning later on in the track, right? And here it is, and I'd like you to stick with me for a minute as I kind of go over this. In The Origin of My Depression, she talks about all of these doors being slammed shut, meaning like all of her relationships could be cut off. She could be left by herself in the world from all of her peers, her acquaintances, her friends, her whoever, professional life as well. And that because of her relationship with her ex, she also potentially cut many ties with other people. And this leads me to believe that she feels like there was no one there to help her, like at all, after their breakup. However, all of the doors being slammed shut, the only other mention of a door in this album is that of the door to God's love. And yes, it is partially closed or partially open, depending on how you think about it. But out of all of them, it was the only door that was left somewhat open. But again, I don't think it probably wasn't intentional. I just kind of think it was a little neat. Anyway, this here is another set of lyrics that I just absolutely love. Xandra wonders how God could love her despite having mutilated her. And I think this mutilation could be read a couple different ways. I think it could be read that she was mutilated by being born a trans woman, that having been born in the wrong body has essentially left her feeling mutilated for life. Having gone through testosterone puberty left her body feeling mutilated. I also think that at the same time, this could be a reference to gender affirming therapy and how some people like to call gender affirming therapy a mutilation of the body. She then asks, are we mistakes or are we going exactly to plan? And to me, I think she's trying to reconcile religion with who she is. There are, again, people out there that say that trans people are a mistake, that trans people are demonic and sinners and going to hell. And I think here Xandra is wondering whether all of that is true or if trans people truly are a part of God's plan. And excuse my tangent, it does remind me of kind of the more liberal churches or progressive churches that are more open and affirming to queer people and transgender identities of all sorts. And there's kind of a saying amongst those churches that God created trans people for the same reason God created grapes but not wine, or wheat but not bread. And it's so that we may participate in the act of creation with God. And that's just it. That part of the song there kind of just reminded me of that saying. Towards the end of this verse, the music starts to break down a little bit. We start hearing more of that violent noise that we heard earlier in the album. And in between verses, we also start to hear some very sinister laughing and what sounds like Xandra yelling, "Let me out." And as this song progresses, the noise starts to become more prevalent and a lot more intrusive. I think the progression of noise and music in this song also shows Xandra's anger towards God and those that condemn people in God's name. Whereas in the beginning, it felt as if Xandra was trying to reconcile with God. And then moving on to the second verse, Xandra tells us to never apologize for our sins while we inhabit a body that is, quote, pruned in a way that withers instead of pruned in a way that grows. And I think this first line is in response to those kinds of people that do condemn trans people in the name of God, that say it is a sin to be this or it is a sin to be that, despite, I mean, by their very logic, having been made in God's own image and having to go through a great amount of suffering or challenges to be who they are and be oneself. She also references pruning, which is the process of cutting off dead parts of plants or trees so that the healthy parts of those plants or trees are able to grow better. And again, I think this could be a reference to the surgical process of transition as well, because a lot of times, again, there are people that refer to transitioning, especially male to female, as cutting off one's own genitals, much like pruning is the cutting off of dead pieces. And to some trans people, their genitals might feel like those dead pieces that are preventing them from growing into who they really are. On the flip side, though, Xandra does talk about this pruning leading to withering, which I find very interesting. It leads me to think that she is saying that transitioning surgically, while helpful for a lot of trans people, isn't really the end all be all. That despite going through these surgical processes, some people might still feel a great amount of dysphoria to the point where it might just be an existential thing. It might be something deeply rooted within themselves that really any amount of transitioning won't be able to fix. Then we move on to the refrain, which picks up from here and lasts until the end of the song. And she simply repeats, I hope he has the stained cloth too. And I love the way that this progresses. My initial thought when hearing this is how a lot of cultures around the world like to depict God or Jesus or whoever their deities are as being similar to them, right? So that they can relate better to these beings that are fairly unrelatable and they adapt them to their culture. And to me, I think this stained cloth could potentially be referencing bandages that one would have to wear after going through a surgical transition. So I think what she is saying is hoping that God has to wear the same stained cloth too, is that she wants to relate to God. She kind of wants God to be trans so that she can identify with God herself. But then as this song goes on, it goes from this somber wishing that God has to wear the same cloth to almost angry. Like she wants God to be trans almost like a punishment to God so that God would have to go through the same suffering that she did.
I feel so.
The final track of the album, and also the most somber of them all, this track is a lamentation of a life that was never lived. It's a eulogy for a girl that never was. For me, this song hit very heavy, and almost every time I listened to it to take notes for this video, there were certain parts where I just kind of have to stop and let it wash over me. Throughout this entire final track, Sandra sings in a very haunting way. The song sounds almost like an apology or a confession or even an admission of guilt, or potentially all three at the same time. She starts by talking about kissing someone and being able to taste the girlhood she never had. Maybe Xandra knows that she'll never be able to have that girlhood. She'll never experience those schoolyard or high school crushes. She'll never know what it was like to be that little girl, but on the lips of her lover, she can taste it. She then says that for the first 26 years of her life, she was dead. She seems to regret having not come out sooner, and she said that she even, quote, feels stupid for having waited, and that having waited this long, sometimes it makes her feel as if she wants to give up on her transition. She feels that no matter what she does, she's never going to feel complete in her transition. But at the same time, she feels more alive now than she ever did, and she's actually able to be herself. Even referring to herself as having been dead for 26 years, which in a way is pretty true. Xandra didn't exist for those first 26 years of her life. She was a completely different person, living a completely different life. And Xandra wasn't born until much later on in her life. She also says that every transition, by virtue of having to transition in the first place, is already too late. That by virtue of having a transition, there is already damage that has been done. You are already in a place of otherness compared to your other gender peers that were born and have stayed their assigned gender. So I think she just kind of feels that no matter what she does, she is going to feel out of place. But she knows for certain that what she is doing now is making her a lot happier of a person. The first half of the second verse seems to be Xandra talking about a friend of hers, a friend that I'm going to assume transitioned a lot earlier in life. She talks about this friend having boys at school that had crushes on her, but they would pretend like they didn't, or how their love letters would be concealed as threats. This kind of shows the struggle that trans women face when it comes to dating, especially when it comes to dating cisgender straight men. She talks about how she has had men pursue her, but would never admit to it because they fear as being seen as gay by their peer group, which in and of itself is another issue. And some of this denial is even taken further when it becomes threats towards trans women, because there's just something that feels off where these men maybe feel off about liking a trans woman, and it makes them angry. She then talks about her friend dropping out of school, and I'm assuming it's due to discrimination that she faced. And then her friend turns to drugs and sex work in order to dull the pain and make ends meet. Finally, Xandra comes back into the story. Two broken women that find strength in one another, even through assaults that she talks about. They find truth in one another, to the point that Xandra even says that death would be tolerable so long as she is able to live as her true self. The next part of this verse, and Xandra has said this, is about how she thinks that even though a decade or so ago it would have been a lot harder for her to transition, she would have faced probably a lot more discrimination and potentially even violence. She feels that she still would have felt like it was worth it to go through that transition earlier rather than later. She would rather go through that pain instead of being what she calls a corpse in a closet. But she waited for the right time, she says. And it wasn't the right time for her. She was ready a lot earlier, but she waited for the right time for everybody else. She wanted to be able to come out and be secure in her own body without having to worry about anything. She then laments that she's regretful for having known that she was trans for quite some time deep inside of her, but actively trying to repress it. That she felt as if she actively contributed to the death of Xandra as she knows herself now. She talks about how during this phase of repression, she thought it would be better to keep it inside and hide it and allow herself to slowly rot from the inside out than it would be for her to live her true self and face the consequences that could have came with at the time. She talks about how she thought that that was good enough, that being able to survive, knowing on the inside that who she was on the inside wasn't a reflection of who she was on the outside, was good enough for her. She would rather die safely than live a dangerous truth until the moment of her birth. Her birth is Xandra. And when she allowed herself to be who she was, she realized that no amount of hiding was worth it for her. The song then ends with Xandra wishing she had always been herself. And I don't know if she means always been herself, as in always acknowledge that she was trans from a younger age, or maybe wishing even that she was born a cisgender woman. Could even be both. But she says that she just wishes she had done it, and that the hell that she would have been through would have been worth it, at least if she could be a woman in hell too. And she talks about how hell is her truth. She acknowledges that her life is going to be full of suffering, as all people's life is going to be full of suffering at some point. There is always going to be something that we are going through or we have to struggle against. Even when we're at our happiest of times, there are always struggles. But she wishes that she could be herself. She would rather be herself and struggle than hide and slowly rot from the inside out and still live in hell. And that's where the album ends. All right, those of you that stuck around, welcome to the end. I really do appreciate you sticking this out. It has been a long video, and I'm glad you got to sit here, and I'm glad I got to rant about an album that I just absolutely love. And it's one that couldn't have popped up on my radar at a better time. It's been a very cathartic experience for me, and it's allowing me to reflect a lot on some things that have been going on in my own life and been going on in my own head. Hopefully, after this, you go ahead and go and listen to the album. It really is just, it's an awesome experience. And then come back here and tell me what you think. Tell me what you thought of the album. Tell me that my opinions are wrong and yours are right, and that's okay. Or if you have already listened to the album, please feel free to geek out in the comments over it because it's great. Or if you have any sort of constructive criticism too, also let me know down in the comments. I will try to make these videos better as I move forward. And I'm happy to be making this kind of video now where I can talk about something that I really do enjoy. Also, if you like what I did here, feel free to leave a like. Feel free to subscribe if you want to see more of this. Finally, this whole video has been super heavy. It was an absolute process to make this, and it's left me feeling like a little bit drained if I'm going to be real with you. The next video is going to be on a fun album. I'm not going to do a heavy album after this. It's going to be a super fun album, and it's another one that I've been listening to just like nonstop, just out and about. So I'm looking forward to making this one too. And then finally, I'm a little bit of a self promotion. I do stream on Twitch Mondays, Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Fridays from 8:30 a.m. to 2 p.m. Central Standard Time. I don't do anything musically there except for maybe like listen to music sometimes, but I mostly just play video games. Anyway, thanks for stopping by, and I hope to see you next time. Themes that seem to gel. Oh my gosh. The first track on this album is oh my gosh. Okay, one more time. Or just again, I guess until we get this. Whereas, no, fuck. The fourth track on this title, and as she says in the song, she feels up, she feels up, oh my goodness. Las Vegas, the fuck? Get out of here.